The heat in Kingman, Arizona does not arrive gradually. It does not ease you in. It simply appears one morning in
You
early
think you
July
can just
like an
sit there?
unwanted house
I
guest
don't
who
know
has
what
no
you
intention
want.
of leaving,
Hey, leave him
pressing
alone.
down
Get
on
your
the
hands
cracked
off me.
asphalt of Route 40 with the full weight of a sky that has forgotten what clouds look like. By 10 in the morning, the thermometer outside Vera's roadside diner read 107 degrees. By 11, nobody was checking anymore. What was the point? Vera's had been sitting on the same stretch of highway since 1962. The sign out front, white letters on a red background, two of the bulbs burned out, still promised the best pie in Mojave County, and depending on who you asked, that claim was not entirely without merit. The building itself was the color of old cream, sun-bleached and wind-scoured, with a row of windows along the front that the afternoon sun turned into mirrors. Inside, the air conditioning did its best. Its best was mediocre. But it was cold enough to matter, and on a July morning in Arizona, cold enough to matter was all anyone asked for. The door opened at 10:58, not swung, not pushed. It opened with a kind of deliberate, unhurried precision that was almost architectural, just wide enough for a wheelchair to pass through, held steady for exactly as long as it needed to be, then released. The woman who came through it did not ask for help. She did not look around to see if anyone was watching. She simply came through the door the way a ship comes into harbor, slowly with total authority, as if the harbor had been waiting for her and not the other way around. Her name was Margaret Calloway. Everyone in Kingman who knew her at all called her Maggie. She was 79 years old. She was a small woman which surprised people who had not met her before, because somehow the idea of her, once they came to have one, seemed larger than the physical reality. She sat in a manual wheelchair, not electric, and she moved it herself with hands that trembled slightly and continuously, a fine rhythmic tremor that never fully stopped. Parkinson's had been for 11 years. The right leg of her dark slacks was folded and pinned just below the knee, neat as a letter, no prosthetic. She wore a flannel shirt the color of faded sage, long sleeved, despite the month the cuffs buttoned to the wrist. On her head sat a baseball cap, navy blue, the brim curved and soft from years of handling. Across the front, in gold thread that had aged to the color of old mustard, were the words USS Resolute. Her eyes were the thing. They were blue, not a gentle blue, not a warm blue, but the particular shade of blue you find at high altitude on a January morning, the kind of blue that has no softness in it at all. They moved across a room the way a surveyor's instrument moves across a landscape. Methodical, complete, missing nothing. Whitfield Oakes, who went by Whit and had been working the morning shift at Vera's for 3 years, watched her come through the door the way he watched her come through the door every Tuesday and Thursday. He already had the coffee pot in his hand. She rolled to table 4 without looking at it. Table 4 sat in the left rear quadrant of the diner, its back against the wall, positioned at an angle that allowed a clear sight line to the front door. Both windows, the hallway to the restrooms, and the pass-through window to the kitchen. It was not the most comfortable table. It was not the table closest to the air conditioning. It was, however, the table from which you could see everything, and from which it was very difficult for anything to approach you unseen. Maggie had chosen it on her first visit to Vera's 5 years ago, and she had sat there every single time since. Whit poured the coffee before she had fully settled black. No sugar, no cream, temperature as hot as the pot could deliver. He set it in front of her with the handle at her right hand where her tremor was slightly less pronounced. He had learned that in the first month. Morning, Maggie. Morning, Whit. Her voice was low and unhurried, the consonants precise in a way that suggested a lifetime of being understood clearly in difficult conditions. She wrapped both hands around the ceramic mug, and for a moment she simply held it, feeling the heat move through her palms. How's Rosalie? Rosalie was Whit's younger sister, 26 years old. Crohn's disease diagnosed 4 years ago, managed poorly, flaring badly since spring. Whit paid for her medication out of his own wages and said nothing about it to anyone. Maggie had noticed the way he sometimes counted his tips twice at the end of a shift, and she had asked him once quietly, directly, the way she did everything, and he had told her the truth because something in the way she asked made lying feel beside the point. She had a rough night, he said. Doctor wants to adjust the dosage. We'll see. She's tough, Maggie said. Yeah. He looked at her for a moment. Yeah, she is. He left the pot on the table and went back to the counter. The diner was quiet. Crawford, a long-haul trucker out of Barstow who ran the I-40 corridor twice a week and had been stopping at Vera's for as long as Maggie had sat at the counter with a slice of cherry pie and a cup of coffee in the particular stillness of a man who was comfortable being alone with his thoughts. In the back booth, a young couple, somewhere in their mid-20s road trip bags, stacked beside them, a paper map spread across the table in the increasingly quaint way of people who did not entirely trust their phones were having the quiet, slightly tense conversation of two people who had been in a car together for too many hours. The diner smelled of coffee and bacon grease and the faint sweetness of the pie in the display case by the register. The jukebox in the corner was playing something slow and pedal steel volume low, barely above the hum of the air conditioning. Maggie unfolded her newspaper, the Kingman Daily Miner Tuesday edition. She read the way she did everything completely, without rushing, her eyes moving across each line with the focused steadiness of someone for whom reading was still an act of genuine attention. Her hands trembled around the edges of the pages. She did not seem to notice. Outside Route 40 lay empty and shimmering in the heat. A semi passed westbound, its wake briefly pressing against the diner windows. Then quiet again. At 11:10, Maggie set her newspaper down. She did not hear anything. Not yet. The sound was still too far away, still below the threshold of ordinary perception, still lost in the white noise of highway heat and distance. But something changed in the quality of the air inside the diner. Some subtle atmospheric shift that had no name in ordinary language, but that Maggie Calloway's nervous system recognized immediately, the way an old sailor recognizes a change in the wind, not by feeling it on the skin, but by some deeper instrument, something trained and interior and very old. She folded the newspaper, set it to the left of her coffee cup, squared the edges, took a long, slow sip from the mug, adjusted the angle of her wheelchair, a small correction of perhaps 15 degrees, almost imperceptible, that brought the front door more directly into her sightline. Whit came by with his pot. "Refill, please," he poured. "You expecting anyone today?" She looked at him, a small pause. "Just my coffee," she said. He smiled and moved on. He did not notice what she had done with the wheelchair. The sound arrived a minute later, not as a single thing, but as a cluster, a rough harmonic of multiple engines, tuned not for efficiency, but for presence, for the projection of something that wanted to be heard before it was seen. It came from the east, growing quickly, filling the highway outside with a kind of aggressive acoustic weight that was entirely different from the smooth passage of the semi. It was jagged, layered, loud in a way that was entirely intentional. Crawford looked up from his book. His jaw stopped moving. The young couple in the back booth went quiet. Whit walked to the front window and looked out, his hand still holding the coffee pot, and what he saw was chrome, a great deal of chrome catching the July sun and throwing it back in hard white flashes, followed by black leather and the dark shapes of big men on bigger machines swinging off the highway and into Vera's parking lot with the casual arrogance of people who have never once in their lives considered whether they were welcome somewhere. There were 12 of them on motorcycles, and behind them, hanging back at the far edge of the lot, away from the formation, away from the diner's windows, came one more vehicle, a black pickup truck, heavy-duty 3/4 ton. It did not park with the bikes. It pulled to the far corner of the lot and stopped. The driver's door did not open. 12 motorcycles spread across the lot in a loose, sprawling configuration that blocked the entrance, blocked the exit, and positioned two of the largest machines directly behind Maggie's 1999 Ford sedan in the handicap space. The engines died one by one, the sound folding away into the desert heat, leaving behind the ticking of cooling metal and the crunch of boots on gravel. Maggie did not turn to look out the window. She lifted her coffee cup. She drank. But her eyes went to the window for just a moment, not to the motorcycles, not to the men climbing off them, but to the black truck at the far edge of the lot. She registered it the way she registered everything, completely, without urgency, filing the observation in the place where things that matter get stored. The rear suspension on the truck was riding low. Notably low. The bed appeared empty. The driver had not moved. Maggie looked at the truck for exactly 3 seconds. Then she looked back at her coffee. The men who came through Vera's front door over the next 90 seconds were large, not uniformly, but on average, significantly larger than the median of American manhood, and they came in with the compressed, shoulder-forward energy of people who had decided before entering that this space now belonged to them. Leather vests over bare arms or dark t-shirts, the vests layered with patches in the dense heraldic language of outlaw motorcycle culture. On the back of every vest, the same image, a skull stylized fierce above block lettering that read Hell's Riders, Arizona. They were loud, not from any specific conversation, but from the aggregate noise of their movement boots on linoleum chairs dragged without care for the floor voices pitched to carry. The jukebox was drowned out immediately. The quality of the light in the room seemed to change as if 12 large bodies had altered the way the air moved through the space. Leading them was a man named Garrett Maddox, though the patch over his heart read Bull, which was the name everyone used, the name that had been his for so long that Garrett had become almost theoretical a name on documents, a name spoken by people who did not know him. He was 48 years old, and he was built like something that had been compressed under great pressure over a long period of time, wide through the shoulders, thick through the chest, a beard gone mostly gray that reached the second button of his vest. A scar ran from his left ear to the corner of his jaw, white and slightly raised, the kind of scar that had a story behind it, and that Bull had no interest in sharing with anyone who hadn't already heard it. He wore dark sunglasses inside. He left them on. He came through the door first, and he stood for a moment just inside it, the way a man stands when he is doing a threat assessment, even if he would not use that language for what he was doing. He looked at Crawford, dismissed him. He looked at the young couple in the back. They had become very interested in their map. He looked at Whit behind the counter, registered him as staff moved on. His gaze swept the room and landed on table 4. On the old woman in the wheelchair, with the trembling hands and the folded newspaper, and the navy cap and the cup of coffee. Something moved across Bull's face that was not quite a smile. It was more primitive than a smile. It was the expression of a predator who has found unexpectedly something that cannot run. He pulled a chair from the nearest table, scraped it loudly, deliberately, and sat down backwards on it, his arms across the back, his eyes still on Maggie. Around him, his men were spreading through the diner, pushing tables together, with no regard for the scraping sound it made on the floor, dropping into chairs, calling out orders, before Whit had reached for his pad. Burgers, all of us, rare. This from a man with a scorpion tattooed on the side of his neck, a wiry, restless man named Dex Pruitt, who sat to Bull's left and had a stillness that was not calmness, but coiled tension. And coffee, fresh, not whatever that old lady's been sitting with for an hour. Whit moved. He was professional, and he was young, and he was beneath his professionalism, frightened though he was, keeping it in a place inside himself where it did not yet show in his hands or his voice. I'll get that started for you. Crawford put a 20 on the counter, set his fork down beside the unfinished pie, and walked out the back. Nobody stopped him. Nobody paid attention. The young couple in the back booth had achieved a state of determined invisibility, faces down still. Bull had not looked away from Maggie. Maggie was reading her newspaper. This was the thing that Bull was not prepared for. He was accustomed to a particular sequence of events when he entered a civilian space. Awareness, the room became aware of them. Assessment, people sized up what they were seeing. Fear, the fear settled in, quiet or not always present. And then the room reconfigured itself around that fear, gave them what they wanted, gave them space and deference, and the unspoken acknowledgement that certain rules did not apply when Bull and his men were present. The old woman at table 4 had not participated in this sequence. She had folded her newspaper and she was reading it, and she had not looked up once, not when they came through the door, not when they dragged the furniture, not when Dex had raised his voice about the coffee. Bull stood up from his chair and walked to table 4. He stood over her. He was a big man, and standing over a woman in a wheelchair was a particular kind of dominance that required no effort, a dominance of geometry, of gravity, of the simple physical math of height and position. He put his hands on the edge of her table and leaned down slightly, bringing his face into her eye line, whether she wanted it there or not. Maggie looked up from her newspaper. She looked at him the way you look at a problem you have seen before in a slightly different form. Calm, assessing, completely without flattery. "Help you," she said. "You're in my seat," Bull said. "I've been in this seat every Tuesday for 5 years," Maggie said. "I think there's been some confusion about whose seat it is." Something rippled through the men nearby. Not displeasure, not yet more like interest. The old lady had spoken back. This was entertainment. Bull pulled the chair across from Maggie's table and sat down in it, uninvited, spreading his weight across it, with the ease of a man who believed all chairs were his by right. He looked at her hands on the newspaper, at the tremor, at the folded pant leg. You look like you've had a rough run of it, he said. I've had a fine run of it, Maggie said. Thank you for the observation. Those hands, Bull said. That's something, isn't it? Parkinson's, that's right. And the leg. He nodded toward the folded hem. War. Old age, Maggie said, which was not entirely a lie and not entirely the truth, and she said it with the flatness of someone who had given a shorter answer than the question deserved and knew it and did not care. Bull leaned back in his chair. He was enjoying this. The entertainment value had increased. Here was an old woman who had not yet understood what the appropriate posture was in his presence, and explaining that posture to people was something Bull had always found satisfying in a way he could not have articulated and did not try to. You know what I think? Bull said, his voice dropping into the register he used when he wanted people to feel the weight of what was coming. I think somebody like you, a little old lady all alone, shaking hands one leg, I think somebody like that has spent her whole life depending on other people. Has she? He looked around at his men. Dex was watching, chewing something, his eyes flat and attentive. What do you think spend your whole life depending on other people? I spent my whole life being the person other people depended on, Maggie said. There's a difference. The table went momentarily quiet. Bull's expression shifted not to anger, not yet, but to something that preceded anger, a slight contraction around the eyes, a tightening at the jaw. He was not accustomed to old ladies saying things that required him to pause and recalculate. Whit appeared at the table with a coffee pot. Sir, can I get you anything while you wait for... I didn't ask you a question, Bull said without looking at him. Whit stopped. Leave him alone, Maggie said. Her voice was level. He's doing his job. You want something, you tell him what you want. That's how it works in here. Bull looked at her. The pause was longer this time. Then he smiled, a wide, slow smile that did not reach his eyes at all. You got a real mouth on you for a woman your age. He looked at Dex. You hear that, Dex? Dex heard it. He was already moving not toward Bull, but toward the table, standing up from his chair and walking over with the easy predatory looseness of a man who was very comfortable being a threat. He positioned himself beside Whit close enough that Whit had to make a conscious decision not to step backward. You know what I notice? Dex said, looking down at Maggie. I notice your hands are going like a flag in a storm. You having trouble holding that coffee? Maybe we should help you with that. I'm managing fine, Maggie said. You sure? Dex reached out and tilted the coffee mug just slightly enough to slosh the hot liquid toward the rim. Not quite over it, not quite. Looks like it's hard for you. Whit said, hey. Dex turned to look at him. The look was enough. Whit stopped. Maggie set the newspaper down. She looked at Dex, then at Bull with the steady recalibration of someone who has just received new information about the scope of a problem. I'm going to ask you, Maggie said, addressing Bull directly, to have your man step back from this table and to let my server do his job. I'm going to ask you that once. Bull spread his hands wide, a theatrical gesture of helplessness. And if I don't, then we'll be having a different conversation, Maggie said. And I'd rather not. Bull laughed. It was genuine, a real laugh, a delighted laugh, the laugh of a man who was having a better morning than he'd expected. He looked at his men with the look of someone sharing a joke, and several of them smiled or chuckled or shook their heads at the audacity of the small woman with the shaking hands. Lady, Bull said, leaning forward, I don't think you fully understood your situation. He reached out and took hold of Whit's wrist. Whit went rigid. The coffee pot in his hand sloshed. Hey! Maggie's voice did not rise. It sharpened. A surgical instrument, not a hammer. Let him go. The table went dead silent. Even the men who had been talking at the pushed-together tables across the room seemed to feel the change in the air and stopped. Bull looked at Maggie. His hand remained on Whit's wrist. Excuse me. I said let him go. Bull released Whit's wrist slowly with deliberate leisure, the way you release something when you want to make clear that you are releasing it by choice rather than compulsion. He pushed Whit aside with a slight motion of his shoulder. Whit stumbled back, caught himself on the counter. Bull stood up from the chair across from Maggie. He was very tall when he stood. He placed his hands on the arms of her wheelchair, one on each side, and leaned down until his face was close to hers, close enough that she could smell the stale coffee and tobacco on his breath, the leather, the road. You're going to want to be quiet now. Bull said softly. You're going to want to sit there and drink your coffee and be invisible. Because you are old and you are alone, and there is nobody in this building who is going to help you. And the sooner you understand that, the easier this morning is going to go for you. Understand. Maggie looked at him. Her hands were trembling on the armrests of her wheelchair, the continuous rhythmic tremor of 11 years of Parkinson's. She looked at him with those January sky eyes, those eyes that had seen things in places that had no names on any map he had ever looked at, and she said nothing. Bull straightened up. He reached out and took hold of the bill of her cap, the USS Resolute cap, navy blue gold thread, and lifted it off her head. He turned it over in his hands, examining it with the exaggerated interest of someone making a point. What's this? He said. Navy, you were in the Navy. I was, Maggie said. What, you were a secretary? More laughter from the assembled men. You file papers, make the coffee. Something like that, Maggie said. Bull dropped the cap on the linoleum floor. Maggie watched it fall. Then Bull lifted his boot, a heavy engineer's boot, steel-toed, the leather worn and road-blackened, and set it on the cap. He pressed down, slowly rotating his heel, grinding the gold lettering into the floor. The cap flattened. The brim bent at an angle it was not designed for. Clumsy, Bull said. Maggie looked at the cap on the floor. Her face did not change. But something behind her face, something deep and interior, some slow and ancient mechanism shifted, like a lock being turned, like a pressure valve making a very small, very controlled adjustment. You shouldn't have done that, Maggie said quietly. Yeah, Bull said. What are you going to do about it? Whit moved from behind the counter, his jaw set, his hands balled. That's enough, he said. That is enough. You need to. Dex was there before Whit had finished the sentence, one hand flat on Whit's chest, pushing him backward with enough force to send him into the shelf of coffee cups behind the counter. 3 cups fell. 2 broke on the floor. Whit? Maggie's voice sharp and clean. He looked at her. She shook her head once. Don't. He stopped. His fists were still clenched. Bull had walked to the window. He was looking at the parking lot, at Maggie's Ford sedan in the handicap space, at the black truck in the far corner, sitting still. Driver's door closed, windows up. Nice car, he said, meaning the Ford. Old but nice. He turned back to the room. Dex, go get her keys. Dex moved to Maggie's table. He was not gentle about it. His hands went into the pockets of her flannel shirt, patting them down with the efficiency of someone who had done this before, had rifled through other people's things in other rooms, and found the experience unremarkable. He found the keys in the right breast pocket, a modest key ring, a single small fob, and attached to it a miniature keychain figure, a tiny Navy diver's helmet detailed in old, the chrome worn to a dull silver. Dex held up the keys. Got 'em. Go pop the trunk, Bull said. See what Grandma's hauling. I wouldn't do that, Maggie said. Dex stopped. Yeah, why not? Because what's in that car is government property, Maggie said. And the people who issued it to me take a very dim view of unauthorized access. Dex looked at Bull. Bull made a short, dismissive gesture. Dex went to the door, the keys jangling. Bull pulled a chair from the nearest table and sat down across from Maggie again. From somewhere inside his vest, he produced a knife. A Bowie knife, the blade 7 inches of flat polished steel, the handle worn smooth with use. He opened it with the practiced ease of a man for whom the blade was unremarkable, and he began cleaning his fingernails with the tip. You know what I keep thinking about, Bull said conversationally, is that coffee of yours. Must be getting cold by now. You should drink it while it's still warm. He reached across the table and picked up Maggie's mug. He looked at it. Then he looked at her. In fact, let me help you with that. He turned the mug over. The coffee, still hot, still close to the temperature, Whit had poured it at 40 minutes ago, poured onto Maggie's lap, soaked through the flannel, through the slacks beneath. The heat was immediate and severe. Maggie gasped, a short, involuntary intake of breath, the body's honest response to heat on skin before the will can intervene. She gripped the armrests of her wheelchair. She did not cry out. She did not beg. She sat there in the heat and the wet, and she breathed 4 counts in 4 counts, hold, 4 counts out, the old pattern, the one that had gotten her through things that Garrett Maddox could not have imagined, and would not have survived. Whit made a sound from behind the counter that was between a word and a shout. Bull stood. He walked around behind Maggie's chair. He gathered a handful of her silver hair in his fist and pulled her head back slowly until her throat was exposed. The Bowie knife appeared at the left side of her neck. The tip of it, just the tip, pressed against the skin above her collarbone. "You scared now," Bull said quietly, his mouth close to her ear. "Tell me you're scared." Maggie breathed. 4 in, 4 hold, 4 out. The knife tip was a pressure against her skin, a small, precise pressure at the edge of pain, promising more. Her hands resting on the armrests of the wheelchair were trembling. And then in the space of perhaps 3 seconds, they stopped. The tremor simply ceased. Both hands simultaneously went still, completely still. The stillness of stone, the stillness of deep water. Bull felt it. He did not understand what it meant. But something in some old pre-rational part of him registered the change, and for the first time in this particular morning, a shadow of something that was not quite doubt crossed the back of his mind. Maggie said evenly, without fear, in a voice that carried the weight of a very long history, "Son, I have had a blade at my throat in places you could not find on a map, held by men who had been trying to kill people for their entire adult lives. You don't scare me. I want you to hear that clearly. You do not scare me at all." She paused. "You bore me." Bull snarled and pressed the blade tighter. A single thin line of red appeared at the edge of the steel. The door opened behind them. Dex came back in. He was not moving with the same loose swagger he had left with. Something had changed in the quality of his motion. It was more careful now, more interior, the movement of a man who has gone outside expecting to find one thing and has found another. He was carrying the keys, and he was carrying something else. A photograph. Black and white, slightly curled at the edges, from years in an enclosed space, the kind of photograph that has lived in a closed environment for a long time and bears the marks of that tenure in the slight yellowing of its border and the particular texture of its surface. He held it the way you hold something you picked up before you understood what it was and now are not certain what to do with. He walked it to Bull. Bull looked down at it. He had to shift the knife slightly to take the photograph in his free hand, and that slight shift was the first time in the last several minutes that the blade had moved away from Maggie's throat by even a fraction of an inch. He looked at the photograph. 8 people in full tactical gear, desert terrain somewhere the vegetation sparse, and the light harsh and the equipment comprehensive. Faces mostly obscured by kit and eyewear. Except for one. A woman smaller than the others, standing at the center of the group, with a stillness that was not posed but entirely natural, the stillness of someone who has been positioned at the center of things for a long time and finds it neither remarkable nor uncomfortable. Bull looked at the photograph. He looked at Maggie. The woman in the photograph had the same quality of attention in her posture that the old woman in the wheelchair had in her eyes. It was not a quality that aged. It was structural, not cosmetic. It lived in the spine and the set of the bone and the way the weight was distributed across the feet. And even in a photograph taken in a desert somewhere decades ago, it was completely legible. "That's you, Demamo," Bull said. Maggie did not answer. She wrapped her hands around the replacement coffee mug that Whit had quietly set in front of her. While Bull's attention had been elsewhere, she had watched him do it from the corner of her eye, watched the small act of care performed under conditions that made small acts of care feel enormous. She looked at the mug. She did not look at Bull. Bull set the photograph on the table between them, face up. He looked at it for a moment longer than he intended to. Then he pushed it aside with the back of his hand. "Old picture," he said, more to himself than to anyone else. But Dex, standing behind Bull, had not stopped looking at the photograph. He looked at it, and then he looked at Maggie, and something in his face had changed, not dramatically, not in any way he would have admitted to, but in the small recalibration of a man who has registered new information and is quietly revising a calculation he had believed was already complete. He went back to his seat. He did not look at Maggie the same way after that. Bull shoved the photograph off the table. It landed face down on the linoleum beside the crushed cap. He reached into his shirt pocket. He produced a phone. He made a call. He spoke briefly, too low for anyone else to hear, and then he looked back at Maggie. "You know what I keep coming back to?" Bull said, releasing her hair, straightening up, moving back around to face her. "Is that phone call you're about to make, because I can see it coming. Old lady thinks she's going to call somebody. He spread his hands. Go ahead, call whoever you want. Sheriff Miller needs 40 minutes to get out here on a good day. We'll be gone in 20. Whatever story you have cooked up in that head of yours, it doesn't end the way you think it does. Maggie reached into her shirt pocket. She did it slowly, carefully, with the deliberate movements of a woman managing a tremor that was no longer entirely present. She produced a phone, a clamshell model, the kind that flipped open, the kind that most people had not carried in 15 years. She opened it with her thumb. Who are you calling? Bull said. The knife was still in his hand. Maggie pressed and held the number 2. She put the phone to her ear. Bull laughed, short and contemptuous. Who are you calling? Old lady 911, the sheriff. Shepard. Her voice had changed. The voice that came out of her now was not the voice of a 79-year-old woman drinking coffee and reading the paper in a highway diner on a Tuesday morning. It was clipped. It was precise. It was the voice of someone who had spent decades speaking in situations where being understood completely and immediately was not a professional courtesy, but a survival requirement. Code red, Vera's roadside diner, Route 40, Kingman, 12 hostiles, bladed weapon confirmed, civilian injured. A pause. She was listening. Copy that. She looked at the Coca-Cola clock on the wall above the pass-through window. Red and white, the second hand moving in its faithful sweep. 11:23 a.m. 18 minutes, Maggie said. Make it 15. She snapped the phone shut and set it on the table. The room was completely silent. Bull still had the knife in his hand, but something had shifted in the geometry of the room. Some weight had redistributed itself in Bull, who was a man of considerable experience with threat in its various textures, could feel it without being able to name it. Who was that? He said. Maggie looked at the clock. Then she looked at her coffee mug on the floor where it had fallen when Bull upended it. Then she looked at the cap, her cap, the USS Resolute cap, flattened under the heel of his boot, lying face down next to the photograph he had discarded. Somebody who's very rarely late, she said. Bull released a short breath that was meant to sound like dismissal. He walked to the window and looked out at the parking lot, at the highway beyond, at the heat shimmering off the asphalt in long, colorless waves. Empty, quiet, the desert in every direction. His eyes found the black truck at the far edge of the lot, still there, driver's door still closed. He turned back and looked at the old woman in the wheelchair with the wet clothes and the steady hands and the January sky eyes. Nobody's coming, Bull said. Maggie picked up the fallen mug from the floor. She set it upright on the table. She folded her hands in front of her hands that were for this moment remarkably inexplicably still. 15 minutes, she said. She glanced at the clock. Until what? Bull said. Maggie looked at him. That look. The one that was not fear and not bravado, and not the look of someone performing courage because they felt they had to. It was simply the look of someone who already knew how the rest of the morning was going to go. Until you understand, she said, exactly who you've been talking to. Outside Route 40 lay empty in the July heat. For now, the clock on the wall read 11:23 a.m. Whit Oak stood behind the counter with his back against the shelf of surviving coffee cups and his arms at his sides and his jaw set in the particular way of a young man who is frightened and ashamed of being frightened and is managing both of those things by holding very still. He was watching Maggie. He had been watching her since Bull had poured the coffee on her lap, since the knife had appeared, since she had made the phone call. In that voice, that other voice, the one that had come out of her like something stored in a different room of herself and only now opened. He did not know what to do with what he had heard. He did not know what to do with the fact that her hands had stopped shaking. Bull had moved back to the center of the room. He sat at the head of the long configuration of pushed-together tables his men had assembled, and he was eating a burger that Whit had brought out on autopilot because bringing food was something Whit knew how to do, and doing something known felt safer than doing nothing at all. Bull ate with the appetite of a man who had decided the morning had been handled, and the old woman in the corner was a settled matter, and the only remaining question was the quality of the beef. It was not quality beef. Vera's had never claimed otherwise. The other 11 men ate and talked and took up space with the aggressive ease of people who have never once doubted their right to take up space. Dex Pruitt sat to Bull's immediate left, the scorpion on his neck flexing slightly, When he turned his head, which he did often, toward the window, toward the door, toward Maggie, toward the window again, he had the restlessness of a man whose nervous system was calibrated for threat and who found the absence of active threat not relaxing but itchy. Since he had come back in from the parking lot with the photograph, there was something different in the quality of his watchfulness. He looked at Maggie more than the others did, and he looked at her differently. The young couple in the back booth had not moved, had barely breathed. The boy had his arm around the girl, and they were both looking at the same point on the table with the concentrated focus of people trying to make themselves two-dimensional. Maggie sat at table 4. She had taken a napkin from the dispenser, and she was pressing it against her lap, working at the cooling coffee with the patient, methodical attention of someone performing a task that needs doing, regardless of circumstances. Her clothes were wet, and the skin beneath them had been scalded, and the pain was a fact she had filed away in a place reserved for facts that were real but not currently actionable. She had been in pain before. She had been in more pain than this in places far less comfortable than a highway diner in Arizona, and she had done her job in those places anyway, and she would do it now. She looked at the clock. 11:26 a.m. 12 minutes. She looked at Whit. He was watching her with the expression of someone who wants badly to act and has been told not to and is struggling with the instruction. She caught his eye and held it for a moment and gave him the smallest, most deliberate nod. Not reassurance. Something more specific than reassurance. An acknowledgement. I see you. I know. Hold. He breathed out slowly and stayed where he was. Maggie turned her attention back to the room. This was what she did and had always done in the spaces between action. She gathered information. Not anxiously, not with the frantic scanning of someone who is frightened, but with the steady, systematic attention of someone who had been trained to understand that information was the only currency that reliably held its value under pressure. You could lose your weapon. You could lose your position. You could lose your footing, your cover, your communications. But what you knew, what you had observed and cataloged and understood that stayed with you. She watched the 12 men. She watched the way they organized themselves around Bull, who deferred, who bristled, who watched him for cues before reacting to anything. She cataloged the ones who were primarily performers, who needed an audience for their aggression, who would fold without social reinforcement. She identified the two who were genuinely dangerous independent of their leader. Dex was one, in a large, quiet man, at the far end of the table with a shaved head and pale eyes, who had not laughed at any of Bull's jokes and had not spoken to anyone since they came in, and who ate his burger with the focused efficiency of a man conserving energy. She noted the exits. She noted the positions. She noted the angles. She thought about the truck, low rear suspension, driver who had not moved, traveling with the convoy as trailing escort rather than integrated formation. A dedicated vehicle deliberately inconspicuous, positioned away from the attention-drawing motorcycles. She had seen that configuration before, not here, not in Arizona, but in other places in other contexts, and the profile was always the same. The bikes were the theater. The truck was the business. She thought Flagstaff, and then she thought 3 o'clock. And then she filed those thoughts in the place where things that need to be passed on get kept until they can be delivered. She looked at the clock, 11:28 a.m., 10 minutes. At the long table, Bull had finished his burger and was wiping his hands on a paper napkin with the leisurely thoroughness of a man who has nowhere pressing to be. He looked at Maggie. He had been looking at her intermittently since she made the phone call, not with concern, but with the slightly irritated attention of someone who has been given a puzzle he believes is simple and is annoyed it has not yet resolved itself. You know what I keep coming back to? Bull said loud enough to carry across the room. Is what you said on that phone, code red. He shook his head with the amused tolerance of a man explaining something to a child. Code red, like we're in a movie, like you're some kind of operator. You were in the Navy in what, the 70s? What did you do? Type memos? Maggie said nothing. That phone call, Bull continued, standing up from his chair and walking toward her, went to nobody. Or it went to some old man in a retirement community somewhere who served with you 40 years ago and is going to make some calls that aren't going to reach anybody who matters for another 45 minutes. And by then, he spread his hands, we are going to be long gone. We have places to be. Don't we, boys? A general sound of assent from the table. We have a schedule, Bull said. He stopped at the edge of table 4. So you're going to sit there and you're going to be quiet, and when we leave, we're going to take that Ford of yours, call it a toll for the inconvenience, and you're going to wait for whoever is coming, and you're going to tell them that a bunch of bikers came through and there was a misunderstanding and everybody went home fine. He paused. You understand what I'm telling you. Maggie looked at him. She looked at the clock. Then she looked back at him. I understand everything you are telling me, she said. Something in the phrasing made Bull pause. Not long, a half second, a fraction of a beat. Then he turned back to his table. That was when Dex's phone buzzed. Dex pulled it from his vest pocket, looked at the screen, and the color of his face changed in the way faces change when a screen shows you something you were not prepared to see. He stood up and walked quickly to Bull, leaning close, showing him the phone. Bull looked at it. He looked at it for a long moment. His jaw moved once the way jaws move when the thing the teeth want to do is clench. He straightened up. How far back? He said, his voice low. Message says needles, Dex said. But that was 10 minutes ago. Bull looked at the window, at the highway, at the black truck sitting in the far corner of the lot, still impatient. We need to move, Dex said. I know we need to move. Bull's voice had changed. The theatrical quality was gone, the performance of ease and dominance stripped away to reveal the functional, operational man underneath. He turned to the room. Finish up. 2 minutes. We roll. The men began to move with a speed and efficiency that had not been visible in the sprawling, leisurely way they had entered. Chairs pushed back, vests straightened, hands found pockets and handles in the particular items each man always knew the location of. Maggie watched. She had heard the exchange clearly. She had confirmed what she needed to confirm. She looked at the black truck in the corner of the lot, and she thought about the rear suspension riding low, and the driver who had not moved, and the schedule that required a 2-minute emergency departure protocol, and every piece of it locked into place the way pieces lock into place when the pattern was already there, and you were simply waiting for the final elements to arrive and confirm it. Bull looked at her. Change of plans, he said. We're leaving, but the Ford stays. Consider it payment for the meal. He reached into his vest and produced a folded bill of 20 and dropped it on the nearest table without looking where it landed. For the food. We're not animals. You should leave the car, Maggie said. Bull stopped. What? I said you should leave the car. Take your bikes. Go wherever you're going. Leave the car. A pause, and leave Wit's tip. The room was very still. Bull stared at her. The operational urgency in him was fighting with the older, deeper reflex, the one that could not walk away from this woman without winning, could not leave this room without the old lady in the wheelchair understanding unambiguously the correct order of things. He was a man who had been running on that reflex for 30 years, and it was stronger than strategy, and stronger than caution, and stronger in this moment than the message on Dex's phone. He walked back to table 4. He stood over her. He said quietly close so only she would hear, I don't know who you called. I don't know what you think is coming. But I know you're an old woman alone in a diner, and I know those hands of yours shake so bad you can barely hold a coffee cup. And I know that whatever you think you were, you're not that anymore. You're just old. That's all you are. Maggie looked up at him. Those eyes. How long have you believed, she said quietly, that what a person is and what a person was are two different things? Bull blinked. From outside, from somewhere east on Route 40, a sound arrived. It was not dramatic. It was not the roar of engines or the squeal of tires or anything that announced itself with obvious intent. It was subtle, a low-frequency vibration more felt than heard, the kind of sound that enters through the soles of your feet and the base of your sternum before it reaches your ears. It was rhythmic, deeply, precisely rhythmic. The glass of water on table 4 moved, a slow circular ripple from the center outward. The silverware on the empty table shifted the faintest metallic whisper of metal on Formica. Dex looked at the window. What is quiet, Bull said. The sound grew, not quickly, not with the rapid approach of something on the ground moving at highway speed. This was different. This was vertical. This was coming from above and from distance, simultaneously from a direction that ground-based sound does not typically come from, and it was getting larger in a way that was not merely louder, but physically larger, taking up more space in the air or pressing down on the building with a weight that was almost atmospheric. Dex went to the window. He looked east. He looked up. Garrett, he said, and then he stopped because Garrett was not his name for Bull, had not been spoken aloud between them in perhaps 3 years, and the name had come out of some older and more frightened part of him that had bypassed the current vocabulary and gone looking for something more fundamental. He steadied himself. Bull. Bull had already moved to the window. He stood there and looked at the sky to the east above the low brown hills, where Route 40 curved away toward the Hualapai Valley, and at first there was nothing, just the white-blue expanse of a July Arizona sky, enormous and indifferent, the kind of sky that does not notice you. Then the shapes appeared, 2 of them, low, very low, following the contour of the hills in a way that was not the behavior of news helicopters or police helicopters, which approach from altitude and announce themselves with lights and PA systems and the institutional vocabulary of law enforcement. These came in the way that things come in when they do not want to be visible until they already are, nap of the earth, flying the terrain like a hand running along a surface using the land itself as cover until the last possible moment. They were black, matte black, the kind of finish that absorbs light rather than reflecting it. Small helicopters stripped down, no doors on the crew compartment, with external bench seating along the skids, and on those benches, visible even at this distance, were figures. Men, sitting on the outside of the aircraft with their legs hanging easy and practiced, as if this were a perfectly ordinary way to travel. "Those aren't police birds," Dex said. His voice had a quality it had not possessed 30 seconds ago. "No," Bull said, "they are not. On the highway, something else." Through the front windows, past the glare, the heat shimmer on Route 40 was being disturbed by something moving through it, not one vehicle, but several in a formation that was too tight and too fast and too deliberate to be civilian traffic. 4 vehicles, moving in close convoy, bumper to bumper, at a speed the posted limit did not contemplate. 2 trucks in front, matte, dark, heavy, purposeful. 2 larger vehicles behind, their exact outlines blurred by distance and heat shimmer, but their mass and speed entirely legible. They were not slowing down for the diner's parking lot entrance. "We need to leave," Dex said. "Right now, back door. The bikes are in the front lot," Bull said. "Then we leave the bikes." Bull turned from the window. He looked at the room as men on their feet now, the performance of ease entirely gone. The operational reality of the situation landing on each of them, with the particular weight of things that cannot be managed by aggression or reputation or the number of people standing behind you. He looked at the door. He looked at Maggie. Maggie had not moved from table 4. She was looking at the clock. 11:38 a.m. And then the lead vehicle hit the parking lot. It did not slow down at the entrance. It came off the highway at speed, and the turn was executed with mechanical precision, and it headed directly toward the line of Hell's Riders motorcycles parked in their arrogant sprawl across the lot, and it did not deviate, did not brake, did not give any indication that the motorcycles represented an obstacle worth acknowledging. The sound of the impact was enormous. Chrome and steel and fiberglass, meeting the reinforced front end of a vehicle designed to go places that vehicles are not supposed to go. It was not one sound, but a cascade of sounds. The initial collision giving way to the grinding, crashing, ongoing destruction of machines being dragged under and through and past, the screaming of metal on asphalt, the shattering of things that had been expensive and beloved and were now sculpture. A man at the long table, one of the younger ones, heavy set with a red beard, made a sound that was not a word. He lunged for the door. 2 of Dex's fingers closed on his vest collar and pulled him back. "Don't," Dex said with the authority of someone who has already assessed the outside and found it to be a worse option than the inside. The convoy screeched to a halt in a formation that took approximately 4 seconds to complete, and that left the front of Vera's roadside diner, enclosed in a 3-sided containment of heavy vehicles, each positioned with its front end toward the building, each at an angle that covered a different sector of approach. Dust billowed. Gravel sprayed. The engines died almost simultaneously, replaced by the ongoing thunder of the 2 helicopters, which had come in fast and low over the building and were now hovering, not landing, hovering approximately 60 feet above the parking lot, their rotor wash hammering the roof, shaking the windows in their frames, filling the world with a physical pressure that was less a sound than a condition. Inside Vera's, the overhead lights flickered. The jukebox cut out. The young couple in the back booth had abandoned any pretense of composure. The girl had her face pressed against the boy's shoulder. He was looking at the front of the diner with an expression of complete incomprehension, the expression of someone whose mental map of what a Tuesday morning could contain has been permanently revised. The Hell's Riders stood in the center of the room in a loose cluster, big men made briefly small by the realization that what was coming through the door was not going to be manageable by any of the instruments they had brought with them. Bull stood apart from them at the edge of this cluster, doing what Bull did, assessing, looking for the angle, looking for the version of this situation that resolved in his favor. He was a man who had been in bad situations before and had found his way through them by identifying the thing that the other side wanted and either giving it or taking it away. He was looking for that thing now. He looked at Maggie. She was watching the door. Her hands resting on the armrests of her wheelchair were completely still. Bull's phone buzzed in his pocket. He looked at it. Unknown number. He answered it. A voice, calm, male, unhurried. Mr. Maddox, this is a courtesy call. We're going to come through the front door in approximately 90 seconds. Nobody on your side needs to be hurt today. What happens next is entirely a function of the decisions you make in the next 90 seconds. I'd encourage you to make good ones. The line went dead. Bull lowered the phone. Dex was looking at him. Who was that? Bull didn't answer. The dust outside was beginning to settle. Through the front windows, past the wreckage of what had been 12 motorcycles and was now 12 abstract studies in destroyed machinery, the doors of the convoy vehicles were opening. The men who got out were not in uniform. No badges, no agency lettering, no ranks visible. They wore the practical, anonymous clothing of people whose work requires them to be underestimated until the moment they choose not to be: dark pants, close-fitting shirts, plate carriers in muted colors, backward caps, eyewear that wrapped around. They carried weapons the state of Arizona did not permit civilians to own, short and configured and accessorized with the specific additions of people who use these instruments regularly in conditions of genuine necessity. They moved across the lot in a pattern that covered the ground the way water covers ground, filling every available space, each element, in relation to every other element. No gaps, no wasted motion, no posturing. 12 of them. They stacked at the door with the compressed, coiled efficiency of a mechanism about to release. Inside, nobody spoke. The door opened. Not kicked, not forced. Simply opened quickly by the lead man, who came through it in a single fluid motion that was the physical distillation of a very large amount of training. And behind him, the room filled fast and quiet with the controlled precision of professionals who have done this so many times that it no longer requires thought, only execution. They fanned out. They took positions. They covered every corner, every exit, every sight line, the angles working together the way the angles of a well-designed room work together, each one completing the others, leaving nowhere that was not covered and no one who was not seen. And then the red dots appeared. 12 small points of coherent light, precise and unwavering, each one resting on a chest or a throat or a forehead. The Hell's Riders stood in their cluster in the center of the room, and each one of them had a red dot on him, and the dots did not waver and did not move and were not accompanied by shouting or commands or any of the dramatic verbal architecture of authority asserting itself. The operators were silent, completely, utterly silent. This was, as it turned out, more frightening than noise would have been. Bull had his hands at his sides. He was measuring the room. He knew the difference between the way an amateur holds a gun and the way a professional holds a gun. Every weapon in this room was held by someone who had long since moved past the psychological adjustment of pointing it at another human being. These were people for whom this was technical, not emotional. That distinction meant there was no hesitation available to exploit no moment of moral uncertainty that a quick move could thread through. Bull understood this. The lead operator, the one who had come through the door first, who had moved to the center of the room and now stood between the Hell's Riders and Table 4, was a large man, not young, perhaps 60, perhaps a few years past, with gray threaded through dark hair and a jaw that had been broken at some point and healed at a slight angle, and a scar that ran from the left side of his chin toward his ear. He carried himself with the specific gravity of someone who has been responsible for other people's lives for a very long time and has made peace with that responsibility in a way that did not require it to be visible. He lowered his weapon, let it hang on its sling. He looked around the room, past the bikers, past Whit at the counter, past the couple in the back booth. His eyes found table 4. He looked at Maggie, at the wet clothes, at the small line of dried blood at her collar, at the cap still on the floor where Bull had ground it under his boot, at the photograph face down beside it. Something moved through his face that was not anger exactly, though anger was present in it. It was the expression of a person who has arrived somewhere they were needed and is doing the swift, private arithmetic of what was here before they arrived. He put his hand over his heart. He bent his head slightly briefly. Behind him, without instruction, every operator in the room did the same thing. Maggie looked at the man in the doorway. A long moment of recognition passed between them, the recognition of people who share a history that cannot be summarized, that exists in the body as much as the memory, in the particular way you stand, in the particular way you breathe, and the particular quality of attention you bring to a room that has gone wrong. "Shepard," she said. "I know," he said. "I see it." He turned to Bull. Shepard Raines was 60 years old, and he had the particular kind of presence that accrues in people who have operated for a long time in places where presence is the first line of defense and the last line of retreat. He looked at Bull the way a man looks at a problem he has been given extensive professional preparation to address. "Mr. Maddox," Shepard said. His voice was even, conversational, the voice of a man who has no need to raise it. "You're holding a knife." Bull looked down. He had forgotten he was holding the Bowie knife. It was still in his right hand, had been there since he pressed it against Maggie's throat, had ridden through the following minutes of his diminishing authority without his conscious awareness. He gripped it tighter now. Not as a decision, as a reflex. "I don't know who you are," Bull said. "You got a warrant, you got a badge. Because if you don't, you got no legal right to." "We're not law enforcement," Shepard said. A small silence. "Then what are you?" Bull said. Shepard considered the question with what appeared to be genuine thoughtfulness, the way you consider a question that deserves a real answer rather than a convenient one. "We're a consequence," he said. "Specifically, we're the consequence of every choice you made between the moment you walked through that door and the moment that woman picked up her phone." He glanced at Maggie, then back to Bull. "You made a lot of choices in that window, Mr. Maddox. Not a single one of them was good." Bull's grip on the knife tightened. The men behind him were very still. The red dots had not moved. Nobody had spoken. Dex said quietly in Bull's direction, "Bull, look at their faces." Bull looked. He had been looking at Shepard. He now looked at the others, the operators positioned around the room. Weapons lowered but not holstered expressions that shared a single quality, which was the quality of patience. Not the patience of people who are waiting for something to happen. The patience of people who have decided what is going to happen and are simply allowing the other party the time to reach the same conclusion. There was no fear in the room. None. Not in a single face. Not even the controlled, managed quality of fear being suppressed. There was simply no fear. These were people for whom the current situation did not produce fear because the current situation was for them a familiar one. Bull looked at Maggie. She was watching him. Those eyes. Her expression was not satisfaction and not contempt. It was something quieter than either the expression of a person who has seen how a very long story ends and is waiting patiently for the final pages to be turned. Bull looked at the knife in his hand. He looked at the clock on the wall. 11:41 a.m. He looked at what remained of his motorcycles in the parking lot, visible through the front windows, chrome catching the sun in broken, scattered pieces. He looked at his men. He put the knife on the table. "Smart," Shepard said. He said it without inflection, without satisfaction. A technical observation. From outside, from the direction of the highway, the direction away from the helicopters, the direction Bull had been watching since Dex's phone buzzed, came the sound of additional vehicles. Not fast, not tactical. The deliberate, measured sound of official vehicles moving at official speeds. A dark sedan, then another. Then a third with the particular configuration of antennas and the quality of government restraint in its presentation that communicated without any visible insignia a very specific category of federal authority. They pulled into the lot from the highway end. The doors opened. The woman who stepped out of the lead vehicle was perhaps 55 in dark slacks and a jacket that was precisely wrong for the July heat which meant she had worn it anyway because the jacket was not about the heat. She had close-cropped gray hair and the bearing of someone who had been the most competent person in every room she had entered for a very long time. She looked at the parking spot, at the wreckage of 12 motorcycles, at the helicopters overhead, at the tactical vehicles, at the low-riding black pickup truck that had not moved from its position at the far edge of the lot. She looked at the truck for a moment longer than she looked at anything else. Then she walked toward the diner. At table 4, Maggie picked up the phone. She opened it. She pressed and held the number 3. "Lena," she said, "we're inside. Come through the front." She closed the phone. Bull was looking at her. "You called 2 numbers," he said. It was not quite a question. "I called 2 numbers," Maggie confirmed. The door opened. The woman in the jacket came through it. She looked at the operators, who acknowledged her with the look that passes between professionals who have been in contact by other means and are now simply confirming physical presence. She looked at the Hell's Riders. She looked at the knife on the table. She looked at Maggie. "Margaret," she said. "Lena," Maggie said. The black pickup in the far corner, driver still in it. Rear suspension was riding 4 to 6 inches low when they pulled in. No visible cargo in the bed. Driver stayed with the vehicle through the entire incident, never came inside, never moved. They had a 2-minute departure protocol when they got a warning message about 15 minutes ago. She paused. The suspension on a 3/4 ton doesn't ride that low on an empty bed. Lena looked at her. "Time of your observation." 11:17, Maggie said. 6 minutes before I called Shepard. Lena made a note on her tablet without looking down at it. "The bikes. Third from the left, in whatever's left of that parking lot, check the saddlebags. But I think you'll find the primary quantity in the pickup." Lena Briggs, Senior Special Agent, Drug Enforcement Administration, looked at the Hell's Riders of Arizona. Her expression was the expression of someone looking at paperwork that was going to be extensive. "Garrett Maddox," she said, "you have the right to remain silent." Outside, one of the helicopters was already descending toward the far corner of the lot, settling into a hover directly above the black pickup truck. Bull stood in the center of the room with his hands at his sides and his knife on the table, and 12 red dots still present on various parts of his anatomy, and for the first time in this particular morning, the operational energy went out of him entirely. Not dramatically, not with collapse or protest. It simply drained away like pressure, being released from a system, leaving behind what was actually there beneath it, a 48-year-old man in a hot room in Arizona who had made, as Shepard had said, a very long series of choices that had arrived him here. Maggie watched him. She picked up the fallen mug from the table. She held it up toward Whit without turning around. Whit, who had been standing behind the counter with his arms at his sides and his jaw set and his eyes bright with something that was not tears, but was adjacent to tears in the way that extreme relief is adjacent to grief, looked at her. He looked at the mug. He picked up the coffee pot. He walked to table 4. He poured. His hand was shaking. Hers, resting on the table, was not. "You okay?" he said. His voice was rough. Maggie wrapped her hands around the mug. The warmth moved through her palms. She looked out the front window at the dust, at the broken chrome, at the helicopters settling at the federal vehicles, at Lena Briggs giving instructions to 2 of her agents in the quiet, efficient manner of someone who has been waiting 3 days for this moment and has been very well prepared for it. "I'm fine, Whit," she said. She took a sip of coffee. She looked at the clock. 11:43 a.m., 20 minutes, 18 as it happened. She had asked for 15 and he had made it 18, and she was going to have something to say about that later once the room was clear and the paperwork was started and the helicopters had gone back to wherever helicopters like that came from. She was going to have something pointed and specific to say about 18 minutes, and Shepard was going to take it the way he always took it, with a straight face and a slight tension at the corner of his mouth that was the closest he ever came to admitting that she was right. And he knew she was right and always had been. Outside, Special Agent Briggs was standing next to the black pickup truck in the far corner of the lot. The driver's door was open. An agent in a windbreaker was speaking to someone inside the vehicle. A third agent was walking the perimeter of the truck with a dog, a Belgian Malinois, lean and purposeful, that did not need to be directed toward the rear of the vehicle because the rear of the vehicle was already interesting to it in a way that made its entire body change quality. Maggie watched the dog. She took another sip of coffee. Low rear suspension, she thought. Just like I said. The dust settled slowly. It came down the way dust always comes down in the Arizona desert, without hurry, without apology, in its own time and by its own logic, indifferent to the urgency of the events that had raised it. It filtered through the shafts of midday light, coming through Vera's front windows, and caught there suspended in the brightness, turning the ordinary air of a highway diner into something almost ceremonial, like incense, like the particular quality of light in old photographs of important moments. Outside, the helicopters had descended to a hover just above the lot, their rotor wash diminishing as they eased upward and away, finding a position to the east where they sat against the sky like patient punctuation present, watchful, no longer pressing down on the building with that physical atmospheric thunder, but not gone either, not finished. Still there in the way that certain things remain present after their most dramatic moment has passed, holding the perimeter of something that has not yet fully resolved itself into past tense. The DEA vehicles had multiplied. 3 had become 5, the additional 2 arriving from the west in the quiet official way of agencies that do not announce themselves with lights or speed, but with the steady accumulation of institutional weight. Agents moved across the parking lot in the methodical pattern of people executing a plan that had been written before today, refined and rehearsed, and was now simply being performed. The Belgian Malinois was still working the black pickup truck at the far edge of the lot, and the quality of its attention had not diminished, which told everyone watching everything they needed to know about what was in that truck. Garrett Maddox stood in the center of Vera's roadside diner, with his wrists in federal restraints and his knife on the table behind him, and 11 of his men similarly arranged around the room, each one attended by an agent or an operator or both. The chapter president of Hell's Riders Arizona looked like what he had always been beneath the leather and the chrome and the accumulated mythology of 30 years of highway dominance. A man who had made a long series of choices that had arrived him with the perfect logic of consequence, exactly here. Shepard Raines stood near the door. He was watching the room with the steady sweeping attention of someone who has not yet fully stood down, who will not fully stand down until every element of the situation has been verified as resolved. His weapon was holstered. His plate carrier was still on. He was speaking quietly into a headset, the words clipped and technical, coordinating something outside that involved the helicopters and the timing of the DEA's processing of the site. He kept looking at table 4. At Maggie. She had not moved since Whit poured the second cup of coffee. She sat with both hands wrapped around the mug, her navy cap on the table beside her, retrieved from the floor by Whit, who had picked it up without being asked and set it within her reach without ceremony, the way you do things for people when the gesture matters more than the explanation of it. The photograph that Dex had found in her trunk was on the table as well. Face up now, the 8 figures in tactical gear, looking out from it with the composed collective attention of people who were very good at their jobs and knew it. Maggie had turned it face up herself quietly when nobody was watching. She had looked at it for a moment. Then she had set it beside the cap. Shepard finished what he was saying into the headset. He crossed the room to table 4. He pulled out the chair across from Maggie and sat down, and for a moment he simply looked at her. "You're bleeding," he said. "It's small," Maggie said. "It's at your throat." "I know where it is, Shepard." He reached into a pouch on his plate carrier and produced a small field dressing, the compact, efficient kind, not the elaborate kind, and he set it on the table between them. She looked at it. She picked it up and pressed it to the line at her collar, holding it there with 2 fingers. "The truck," she said. "Confirmed," Shepard said. "Lena's people found 4.5 kilograms in a false floor panel under the rear seat. Meth primarily with a smaller quantity of something they're still characterizing. Driver had a firearm and no license for it. Federal charges on top of the transportation." He paused. "It's enough, more than enough." Maggie nodded. "You clocked the truck when they pulled in," Shepard said. "It was not a question. Rear suspension was low," she said. "Driver stayed with the vehicle. They were using the bikes as cover, a visible, attention-drawing convoy, so that whatever was following registered as incidental. It's an old technique. Doesn't stop working just because it's old," Shepard said. A slight echo, the kind between people who have finished each other's sentences for 35 years without noticing they do it. He looked at her for a moment. "How long had you identified it before you called me?" "Before I called you," Maggie said, "or before they walked through the door." Something shifted behind his eyes, at a quality of recognition of something confirmed rather than learned. He had known this woman for 35 years. He had trained under her for 7 of them. He knew the shape of the way she thought, the way a musician knows a piece of music they have played for a long time, not as information, but as physical familiarity, as something the hands and the nervous system know independent of the deliberate mind. You could have called Lena first, he said. Bypassed me entirely. DEA had the authority here. DEA needed you to close the perimeter, Maggie said. Lena's people are good. They're not what you are. That's a kind thing to say. It's an accurate thing to say. I don't say things because they're kind, Shepherd. You know that. He did know that. He had known it since 1985 when he was 23 years old and newly attached to the intelligence cell at Little Creek. And Margaret Calloway had walked into a briefing room and looked at the 8 young men sitting in it with the look of someone assessing the raw material of a project and finding the material neither impressive nor unimpressive, simply present and workable, and had proceeded to spend the next 4 hours dismantling every assumption they had arrived with and replacing it with something more useful. He had been frightened of her then, not in the way you are frightened of threat, in the way you are frightened of someone who can see you more clearly than you can see yourself. It was the most useful fright of his life. 18 minutes, Maggie said. There it was. The I-40 from our position, he began. I asked for 15. There was a convoy vehicle we needed to let pass before we could move without tipping the surveillance. You had 2 helicopters. We needed both of them for the perimeter. If we'd moved one earlier, Shepherd, he stopped. 18 minutes, she said again. Not angry, not theatrical, simply precise in the way she was precise about everything in the way that precision was for her. Not a personality trait, but a professional standard, a standard she had held for 50 years and did not adjust for circumstances. Yes, ma'am, he said. 18 minutes. I'll note it for the debrief. The corner of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile. The suggestion of one brief and internal, there and gone. Whit appeared at the table. He was carrying a fresh pot of coffee and moving with the particular focus, purposefulness of a young man who needs something useful to do with his hands and has found it. He poured for Maggie carefully the way he always did at the handle at her right side. He looked at Shepherd. Shepherd covered his cup without being asked. You need anything else, Whit said. His voice had recovered its surface steadiness, but underneath it the morning was still audible. Sit down a minute, Maggie said. Whit looked at the room, at the agents, at the operators, at the restrained bikers being processed against the far wall. I should probably... Whit, Maggie said. Sit down. He sat down in the chair next to hers, not across from her, alongside, so they were both facing the room looking at the same view. It was an instinctive arrangement, not planned, and it was the arrangement of someone who has absorbed without knowing. He absorbed it something about how Maggie Calloway positions herself in spaces. She looked at him for a moment. You did well this morning, she said. He shook his head slightly. I didn't do anything. I just stood there. I should have. You stayed, Maggie said. You were frightened and you stayed. You didn't run when Crawford ran. You didn't disappear into the back. You stayed and you did your haul, and when I told you to hold, you held. She paused. That's not nothing. That's most of it, actually. Whit looked at the table. His jaw worked once. I was scared for you, he said. When the coffee... He stopped. When the knife... I know, Maggie said. Were you scared? She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. She did not deflect it. There's a version of scared that is useful, she said finally, that heightens your attention and clarifies your thinking. And there's a version that does the opposite. I've spent most of my life learning to find the first one and use it. She looked at him. Was I frightened this morning? Yeah. Did it help me also? Yes. Whit absorbed this. How do you learn that? Slowly, Maggie said, inexpensively. Across the room, and Shepherd had stood up and was now speaking with Lena Briggs, who had come inside from the parking lot with the deliberate, efficient posture of someone who has confirmed the major elements of a situation and is now managing the documentation. Lena carried a tablet in one hand and a question in the other. She and Shepherd spoke for a moment, then both of them looked at table 4. Lena crossed the room. She pulled out the chair across from Maggie and sat down with the comfortable authority of a woman for whom difficult rooms had long since become ordinary. Margaret, she said. Lena. A pause. You look well. I look tired, Lena said. I've been awake since Thursday on this one. She set the tablet on the table. The truck alone is going to hold them. Federal trafficking charges, interstate transport, the firearm on the driver Maddox is looking at minimum 20 years, probably more, once they trace the chain of custody on the shipment. 3 of the others have outstanding warrants we've already confirmed. The rest are accessories at minimum. The bikes, Maggie said. Some seized as assets in a drug investigation, Lena said. They'll go to auction within 60 days. State has first claim on the proceeds, but given the connection to the investigation, I can make sure a significant portion is directed appropriately. She looked at Maggie. You have somewhere in mind. Disabled Veterans Fund, Maggie said, and the Navy Marine Corps Relief Society. Shepard can give you the specific accounts. Lena noted this without comment in the manner of someone for whom this kind of direction is entirely expected. She had worked with Maggie Calloway in 1991 in a small, unremarkable office building outside of Annapolis on a matter that had required the particular combination of Maggie's tactical intelligence architecture and Lena's investigative authority. They had not spoken for 17 years after that, not because anything had gone wrong, but because their paths had simply not crossed again in any operational context, and both of them were people who did not maintain relationships for social reasons. When Maggie had pressed the number 3 on her clamshell phone at 11:23 this morning, Lena had answered on the second ring and said nothing except location, and Maggie had given it, and that had been sufficient. Some professional relationships are like that. They do not require maintenance. They simply wait dormant and intact for the moment they are needed again. The man who put the knife at your throat, Lena said. Her voice was clinical. That's going to be an additional charge. Aggravated assault with a deadly weapon on a former federal contractor. It applies. I'm not interested in the additional charge, Maggie said. The trafficking will hold him. That's what matters. Lena looked at her for a moment. The knife matters, Margaret. The knife matters to me, Maggie said. To the people whose lives those drugs would have destroyed, the trafficking charge matters more. Focus there. Lena wrote something on the tablet. She did not argue. She had learned in 1991 that arguing with Maggie Calloway about priorities was a project with a very low return on investment. She stood. I'll need your statement before we clear the scene. You'll have it. Lena moved away. Maggie looked at the room. Bull was against the far wall, seated on a chair, wrists restrained, 2 agents standing nearby. The theatrical authority had left him completely not stripped away by any single moment, but eroded steadily from the moment Maggie's hands had gone still, under his knife, through the vibration in the water glasses, through the sound of the rotors, through the convoy hitting the parking lot, and the door coming open, and the red dots appearing, and Lena Briggs walking through from the highway side. It had eroded the way cliffs erode by the accumulation of small forces applied consistently over time. What remained was simply a man, not small, not diminished exactly, but human-sized. Ordinary. Without the borrowed mass of his reputation and his numbers and his hardware, he was a 48-year-old man in a diner in Kingman, Arizona, and he was going to federal prison, and he knew it. Shepard said something to one of his operators, the one they called Reaper, a lean man in his late 30s, with the particular stillness of a long-range shooter who had spent the last 20 minutes near the back exit and was now standing down with the focused internal quality of someone reviewing his own performance. Reaper nodded and moved toward the door. Shepard crossed the room to where Bull was sitting. He stood in front of him for a moment. He looked at him this way you look at something that has been assessed and cataloged and is now simply waiting for the administrative conclusion of a process that has already been decided. Then Shepard reached down and picked up something from the floor near table 4. He had been looking at it since he came in. The USS Resolute cap, misshapen the brim, bent the gold lettering smeared with the grime of a boot heel. He carried it back to table 4. He also picked up the photograph, the black and white image of 8 figures in tactical gear. One woman at the center, and set both of them in front of Maggie. He sat down again, and he looked at the cap, and he looked at her. We'll get you a new one, he said. No, Maggie said. Chief. This one, she said. She picked it up. She turned it over in her hands, examining what had been done to it with the same clear, unsparing attention she brought to everything. The brim was salvageable. The lettering was damaged but legible, USS Resolute, in gold thread that had been old and faded before this morning and was older and more damaged now. She pressed the crown, gently reshaping it. set it on the table in front of her. "I'll have it repaired," she said. "Whit can take it somewhere this week." Whit, still sitting beside her, looked at the cap. "I'll take care of it," he said. "I know a woman on Oak Street who does embroidery. She's good." He paused. "Real good." Maggie looked at him. "Thank you, Whit." Shepard was watching this exchange with the expression of a man who has seen a great deal of the world and its various textures and still finds certain things, the ordinary kindnesses between people, in the aftermath of hard things, worth attending to. "The cap," he said quietly after a moment. "You want to tell him?" Maggie looked at Whit. He was young, 32, a year older than her son would have been if she had had a son, which she had not, though she had had the equivalent of sons in the various forms that equivalent takes over a long career of working with young men and women who needed something that was not quite teaching and not quite command and not quite parenting, but had elements of all three. She looked at Whit, and she saw the morning in his face, the fear he had managed, and the anger he had held, and the steadiness he had maintained under conditions that most people in their 30s, living ordinary lives in highway diners in Arizona, would never be tested by. "USS Resolute," she said. She picked up the cap again, held it in her trembling hands. She was a guided missile destroyer, Cold War era. I served aboard her from 1975 to 1979 in an intelligence support role. We were operating in the North Pacific Aleutian chain, rotating through different tasking depending on the strategic picture at any given time. Whit was listening with the quality of stillness of someone who understands they are being told something that is not usually told. "November 1979, Maggie continued. "We were in the Bering Sea. A storm came up faster than the forecast had indicated. They did that more often than before the satellite coverage improved. We lost 3 men overboard from the aft deck. A wave took them." She paused, set the cap down, looked at it. "The water temperature was 4 degrees Celsius. That's roughly 39 Fahrenheit. In water that cold, useful consciousness goes inside of 15 minutes. Survival time beyond that is measured in minutes, not hours." Whit said nothing. His hands were flat on the table. "The ship came about," Maggie said, "but the seas were heavy and the maneuvering was slow, and by the time we had eyes on 2 of the 3 men, they had been in the water for 11 minutes. A line was thrown. Neither of them could hold it. Their hands were already gone." She stopped. The room around them had its own sounds, agents and operators, the bureaucratic machinery of a federal operation finding its rhythm voices outside the helicopters, at distance the tick of the Coca-Cola clock on the wall. She was in none of it. She was somewhere else, briefly, the somewhere else that old soldiers go when they pull a thread on the fabric of their history. "I went in," she said, "over the side. There was a line on me, a harness tied off at the rail. I reached the first man in approximately 2 minutes. He was conscious but not functional. I held him until the ship's crew could work us both back to the hull. Then I went back for the second." Whit looked at the folded pant leg, the pinned hem below the knee. "The propeller," Maggie said simply. "The ship was still maneuvering. It happens." A pause. "We got all 3 of them back. The third one had managed to get a hand on the line himself by the time I reached him. All 3 survived." She looked at Whit. "That's the cap they gave me when I left the Resolute. The crew took up a collection and had it made. Every man aboard signed the inside of the band." Whit looked at the cap on the table. He looked at it for a long moment without speaking, the way you look at an object after its meaning has been restored to it. Then he looked up at Maggie, and his expression was the expression of someone who has just had the architecture of a room revealed to them, who has been sitting in a building without knowing what held it up and now knows and cannot unsee it. "He stepped on it," Whit said. His voice was very quiet. "He did," Maggie said. "He didn't know." "He didn't know," Maggie agreed. "People rarely know what they're stepping on." "That's not an excuse, but it is a fact." Shepard had been listening from across the table, his hands flat on the surface, his face carrying the expression of a man who has heard this story before and finds in the hearing of it again that it has not diminished. He had heard it in 1987 when Maggie told it to a room of 23-year-olds who needed to understand something about the relationship between cost and commitment. He heard it now and felt, as he always felt, the weight of what it meant to have been trained by this woman, the particular kind of debt that cannot be paid off, only carried forward. He stood up. He walked to where Bull was seated against the wall. Shepard stood in front of him. Bull looked up. His face was swollen slightly on one side from contact during the initial entry. His eyes were clear. Whatever Bull Maddox was, he was not stupid. And stupid people are often easier to manage after events like this morning because they don't fully understand what has happened. Bull understood. The understanding was visible in his face, a precise and unhappy clarity. Shepard looked at him for a long moment. "On your feet," Shepard said. A federal agent nearby made a slight motion of readiness. Shepard raised two fingers without looking at the agent, and the agent settled. This was Shepard's request, not the DEA's, and the agent recognized the distinction. Bull stood. He was still large. Restraints did not diminish the physical fact of him, but physical facts operate differently in different contexts, and the context had changed irrevocably. Shepard took Bull by the arm, not harshly, not with the performative grip of someone making a point, but with the functional hold of someone transporting a person from one place to another, and walked him across the diner, to table 4. Maggie looked up when they arrived. Shepard said, "Down." Bull looked at the floor, the same floor where less than an hour ago he had ground his boot into a woman's cap and discarded the photograph of her life's work without looking at it twice. He looked at Maggie in her wheelchair. He looked at her coffee cup, her hands the field dressing, at her collar, the USS Resolute cap on the table between them. He went down, not all the way but to his knees. A specific and deliberate position, not the instinctive descent of someone losing their footing, but the chosen one of someone who has understood the requirement. He was kneeling in front of the wheelchair of a 79-year-old woman with a tremor in both hands, in a folded pant leg, and a damaged cap from a ship that had been decommissioned before some of his men were born. The room was watching. The agents, the operators with the young couple in the back booth who had not moved in over an hour. Lena Briggs near the door, tablet in hand. Reaper near the window. The remaining Hell's Riders restrained processing what they were seeing. Bull looked at Maggie. Maggie looked at him. She did not look at him with triumph. She did not look at him with the satisfied expression of someone receiving what they are owed. She looked at him with something more complicated and more honest than either of those things, with the clear-eyed recognition of someone who has lived long enough to understand that the men who do things like what Bull had done this morning are not a different species, not constructed of different material, but are ordinary men who made choices over many years that led them with perfect and terrible logic to a diner on a Tuesday morning in July, where they poured hot coffee on a woman and pressed a knife to her throat because they could, because they had always been able to, because nobody in all those years had ever provided them with an adequate reason to stop. She felt something she would not have described as pity exactly, but that occupied the territory adjacent to it. The clear-eyed, unsentimental recognition of waste. "I owe you an apology," Bull said. His voice was rough, not performed. He said it the way a man says something he has never said before in his adult life, and is discovering in the saying of it that it costs more than he expected, and that the cunt is probably appropriate. "You owe several people in this room an apology," Maggie said. "Start where you like." Bull looked at Whit. "I put my hands on you," he said. "That was wrong." Whit said nothing. He gave a single short nod. Bull looked back at Maggie. "I didn't know who you were." "That's not the relevant part," Maggie said. He looked at her. "The relevant part," she said, "is that it shouldn't have mattered who I was. It matters that I was a person. In a diner, drinking coffee. That should have been sufficient reason to leave me alone." She paused. "You saw an old woman. You saw a wheelchair. You saw hands that shake and a leg that ends below the knee, and you saw an opportunity to feel large by making something small. That's the part you need to think about for the next 20-some years, not who I turned out to be, what you saw when you thought I was nobody." The room was very quiet. Bull held her gaze. He was not in this moment the chapter president of anything. He was a man on his knees in a diner, and the woman in front of him was telling him something true, and the truth of it was landing in a place in him that had not been accessed in a long time, possibly ever, and the landing was not comfortable, but it was real. "Yes, ma'am," he said. Shepard lifted him by the arm, walked him back. The processing continued. Agents moved. Documents were produced and noted and signed. Outside, an agent in a windbreaker emerged from the black pickup truck, carrying an evidence bag. Then a second, then a third, unknown. Lena Briggs stood at the perimeter of the truck's location and watched each bag come out with the expression of someone watching the conclusion of a very long calculation confirm itself. The black pickup truck was photographed from every angle and its contents cataloged and its driver transported separately in a vehicle that arrived from the east and departed without ceremony. The remaining Hell's Riders were processed one by one, their identities run against federal databases that returned results in several cases that added additional layers of consequence to an already consequential morning. Shepard came back to table 4 one final time. He stood beside Maggie's wheelchair. He did not sit down. This was the standing of departure, the posture of someone who has completed what they came to do and is preparing to leave, not abruptly, not without acknowledgement, but with the efficiency of someone whose next obligation is already forming in the near distance. "We're going to clear out," he said. "Lena's people can handle the wrap from here. We'll coordinate on the documentation from our end." He looked at her. "You need a ride home." "I drove myself here," Maggie said. "Your car is in the lot. The lot is a federal crime scene." A small pause. "I'll call someone," she said. "I'll have 2 of my people stay until Lena's team clears your vehicle," Shepard said. "Shouldn't be more than an hour." Maggie nodded. Shepard looked at her for a moment. He looked at the cap on the table. He looked at her hands wrapped around the coffee cup, trembling with the familiar Parkinson's tremor that had returned quietly and, without announcement, the stillness that had descended when Bull pressed the knife to her throat had receded, and the tremor had come back as it always came back, as it would always come back, because it was not something she controlled, but something she managed, which is a different thing entirely. He looked at the photograph on the table. 8 figures in a desert somewhere. 1 woman at the center. He looked at it the way you look at something you have seen many times and find each time contains something you had not previously noticed. "You held them for 18 minutes, he said, "alone, with a knife at your throat and a room full of them." 15 would have been cleaner, Maggie said. "Margaret." She looked up at him. "You know what I mean," he said. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked at her coffee cup. "I know what you mean," she said. "The debrief is Wednesday," he said. "Fort Huachuca. I'll send a car." "I can drive to Fort Huachuca." "I know you can. I'll send a car anyway." He straightened. "Wednesday." He crossed the room, gave a final instruction to 2 of his operators who were remaining, and walked through the front door of Vera's roadside diner into the July heat of Route 40, and the door swung closed behind him, and the room adjusted to his absence the way rooms adjust to the departure of significant presences, with a slight atmospheric shift, a recalibration of the quality of attention. Whit was still at the table. He had gotten up once while the processing was ongoing to check on the young couple in the back booth, brought them water, spoke to them, quietly told them an agent would take their contact information and their statement, and then they would be free to leave, which they were at 12:08, the girl with her arm through the boy's arm, and both of them moving toward the door with the slightly dazed energy of people who have been accelerated through an experience. Their nervous systems are still working to integrate. The boy turned at the door and looked at Maggie, at table 4, and something moved through his face that was not a word, was not quite a gesture, but communicated something, and Maggie gave him a slight nod, and they went. By 12:30, the diner was quiet. Lena's team was finishing outside. The 2 operators Shepard had left were near the door, present and professional. The overhead lights had come back to full strength. The jukebox had not come back on, and nobody had turned it on, and the silence where the music had been was not uncomfortable. Whit poured the 3rd cup of coffee. He set it in front of Maggie. He set something else beside it, a plate. On it, a slice of cherry pie. The same variety Crawford had left unfinished at the counter. Cut and plated while Whit was behind the counter during the processing, one of those small, purposeful acts that people perform when the large things are out of their hands. "On the house," Whit said. "For as long as you're sitting there." He paused. "Forever, actually. On the house forever." Maggie looked at the pie. She looked at Whit. "Sit down, Whit," she said. He sat down beside her again. Same chair, same angle, both of them facing the room. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You can always ask. Did you ever think about not calling, about just waiting for them to leave? They were going to leave eventually. They had somewhere to be. You could have just let it happen." Maggie was quiet for a moment. She looked at the room, at the empty chairs where the Hell's Riders had sat, at the damaged floor where the tables had been dragged, at the wall near the counter where Wit had been shoved. Yes, she said, I thought about it. What made you call? She looked at him. At the straightness of him, the careful steadiness he had maintained all morning, the fear he had managed and the anger he had held, and the ordinary, extraordinary decency of a 32-year-old man who worked in a diner and paid his sister's medical bills out of his wages and had stayed when staying was not easy. They put their hands on you, she said. That was the moment. Wit looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face shifted, the particular shift of someone receiving something they did not expect to receive and are not certain how to carry. He looked at the table. Thank you, he said, very quietly. Maggie picked up her coffee cup. Her hands shook with their familiar tremor, the unceasing rhythmic tremor of a nervous system conducting its own slow argument with itself. She lifted the cup anyway, as she always did, as she had done every Tuesday and Thursday for 5 years. The tremor. No impediment to the act, just a condition of it, part of the total reality of being 79 years old and still here, and still upright and still doing the work that needed doing. She drank. She looked out the front window of Vera's roadside diner at Route 40, and the July heat shimmering above it in long, colorless waves at the parking lot, where 2 operators sat in a dark vehicle, and Lena's remaining agents moved through the final stages of their documentation at the crushed and scattered remnants of 12 motorcycles gleaming in the noon sun, with a particular quality that destroyed things sometimes have when the light catches them at the right angle. The clock on the wall ticked. The air conditioning hummed. She thought about Wednesday, about Fort Huachuca, about the debrief, which would be careful and thorough, and would cover the identification of the black truck and the convoy technique, and the timing of the calls and the operational decisions made in the 18 minutes between the phone call and the entry, and she would give her account clearly and completely and without embellishment, because that was what debriefs required and what she had always given them. She thought about the USS Resolute, about November 1979 and 4-degree water and the particular quality of cold that does not feel cold at a certain point, but simply feels like the absence of the possibility of warmth, about 3 men who had gone into the Bering Sea and come back out of it, about the signatures inside the band of a baseball cap that had been folded and pinned and kept through 50 years of a life that had taken her through places and into situations that she had never spoken about in any room that was not already secured. She thought about what she had said to Bull, about what a person is and what a person was, about whether those were the same things she believed they were. She had believed it for a long time, not as a comfort, not as a thing you tell yourself to feel better about. The hardware getting old and the Parkinson's getting worse and the leg being what it was, but as a genuine operational conclusion arrived at through evidence. You were what you had built over the full length of your life. The body changed, the capacity changed, the instruments of action changed, but the thing that had been built, the understanding and the training and the judgment and the particular way you read a room and a person in a situation, that did not go. It did not diminish with the body. It simply expressed itself differently. She had expressed it this morning with a cup of coffee and a fold-up phone and 18 minutes of sitting still. She had held a room full of men with bad intentions for 18 minutes, with nothing but the force of what she understood and the steadiness of what she was, and then the people she had spent her career helping to build had come through the door and done what they had been built to do, and the room was now quiet and the diner was intact, and Whit was going to take his sister to her appointment on Thursday without counting his tips twice at the end of the shift. That was sufficient. That was in fact more than sufficient. Whit was quiet beside her. He was looking at the room, the two of them facing the same direction, watching the same quiet diner return to itself after the morning it had been given. Same time Thursday, he said. Maggie set her coffee cup down. She looked at the USS Resolute cap on the table in front of her. She picked it up and turned it over, looked at the inside of the band, at the faded, compressed signatures. Their pencil and pen and marker, 50 years of handling, worn into the fabric, barely legible now, but present, permanent there. Every man who had been aboard that ship the winter she went into the Bering Sea. Every man who had pulled her back over the rail after the second trip. Every name she had carried on her head every Tuesday and Thursday for half a century. She put the cap on her head. The brim was bent wrong. The gold lettering was smeared. It sat on her silver hair at the angle it had always sat at, which was the angle it would always sit at because some things persist through the damage done to them, not by avoiding it, but by being old enough and substantial enough and sufficiently themselves that damage is simply one more thing they have absorbed and continued through. Same time Thursday, she said. She picked up her fork. She ate the cherry pie. Outside Route 40 lay quiet under the Arizona sky, empty and wide and bright, with the particular promise of roads that go on for a very long time in all directions, and the heat rose off the asphalt in long, slow waves, and the two operators in the dark vehicle watched the lot with the patient, steady attention of people who have been given a bond and will do it until it is finished. And somewhere east on the highway, the last of the federal vehicles was pulling away toward Flagstaff. And somewhere further east than that, in a county facility in Mojave County, Garrett Maddox was being processed into a system from which he would not emerge for a very long time. And the 4.5 kilograms of methamphetamine that had been riding in the false floor of a black pickup truck on Route 40 on a Tuesday morning in July would not reach wherever it had been going. And the people at the end of that road would have to find another way to destroy themselves. And that was not Maggie's problem to solve today. Today, her problem was the cherry pie and the coffee and the clock on the wall that read 12:47, and the young man sitting beside her who had stayed when staying was hard, and the cap on her head with its bent brim and its smeared gold letters and its 50-year cargo of names pressed into the band where no one could see them. And at table 4 in Vera's roadside diner, the woman who had built the men who had come through the door sat with her trembling hands and her damaged cap and her black coffee and her cherry pie, and she looked out the window and she was quiet and she was entirely herself, and the room around her was still standing. It had always been going to.